Today, I'm joined by Emmy-nominated and Ace Eddie winning editor Michael Ruscio, whose work on Death by Lightning helped shape one of the most tonally distinctive historical dramas that I have ever seen. Michael, it's so great to have you on the show.
Oh, great to be here, Robert. Thanks for having me.
You have said before that as an editor, you are the first audience, constantly stepping back and reassessing how something plays. With Death by Lightning, which has such a delicate tonal balance, what were you watching for in those early cuts so that you knew that the show was landing?
Well, I had the opportunity to actually come on a little bit later, so there was a cut and it was fresh. So I came on as a pair of fresh eyes. And so what I was looking for was how am I engaged in this story? Who are these men? What is this about? What is the tone? Is it too historical feeling? Is it trying to be too modern? Is it, too much spirit gum with all the beards? What is the feeling that I'm getting from it? How am I relating to the characters? So for me, that's where I got into it. Is this is like, okay, who are these people? And my sense was in reshaping it that I always wanted to have one man cutting to the other man, and that initially the cut that I saw, it was a little bit more objective, and I felt like it always has to be like, here comes Guiteau, here comes Garfield, and that finding ways to parallel them, be that flopping shots or just finding ways to connect them visually in between the cutting patterns so that you are always leading up to the point, because it's not really, they meet, they have a handshake in episode one, but in episode three they have the big scene together, but which then sort of becomes that De Niro Pacino heat thing that I always like to refer to it as, because you're waiting the whole time. And I felt like we needed to set up a tension where one was always there in the back of your mind when you were looking at the other man.
I'm really glad you said that because what struck me immediately about the premiere in particular is how confidently it sets up this dual narrative between Garfield and Guiteau and how they felt really like entwined, even though they didn't know each other. And to me, that a lot of that has to do with the way that the episode is cut. So from an editing standpoint, why do you think that was actually a really important engine for the show that had lived in that cross-cutting between these two men?
First of all, I think we all wanted it to have a more contemporary feel editorial. So right from the jump, we have the crazy, back in 1969, and then he says like,
So good.
who's Charles Guiteau? And then there he is. He's getting like
Yeah.
water thrown in his face in the jail. And right in the minute that he's in before the board, we have those quick cuts. So we have cut back to when he's like, you can see that he's lying about what happened to him on the street. And we like, because that initially obviously was a scene where we came out of, Charles Guiteau, we met him, he like fell down the balcony, he was running around, he got beaten. And then we just ultimately decided to let's just have these quick, brief flashes, and that made it feel contemporary so that people would know right from the get-go that we weren't, dealing with, this wasn't John Adams. This wasn't a staid, tried and true kind of a historical piece. And I think that the early cutting decisions really kind of reinforced that.
It does. And so for people watching this show who may be wondering, why does this feel so different, so accessible, so modern? A lot of it has to do with the edit. It's very important. And it puts us right in there so subjectively, following these two men's trajectories until eventually, whatever happens, happens.
Mhm.
So episode one has this convention speech that is so extraordinary. When you were editing it, or recutting it, so to speak. What did you want that moment to reveal about Garfield through Michael Shannon's amazing performance?
It's interesting. I was thinking a lot about this because I think as an audience looking at the show, I feel like you almost know more about Garfield than he knows about himself, and
Yeah,
you know less about Guiteau than he knows about himself. So you get that feeling like, let's make this the most stirring, exciting speech. And because he was an orator, and he's giving the speech on behalf of of Sherman. He's not even really running for president,
yeah.
but again, like one of the characters says, nobody gives that kind of speech unless you want it for yourself. So I think that we kind of are a little bit ahead of him in a way, because we know that he's got this, you know, real forceful, passionate performance, and that the idea was to set him up so that he was very strong, very convincing, and yet there's a layer of humility underneath where he would catch himself and like talk about, that we're talking about Sherman, of course. And then we had the added piece of putting in Guiteau, which is like with him with the axe and coming down and like chopping and swearing and finding ways to have that be complementary, almost like one man's subconscious is the other man, and finding a way to not make it so totally pointed, because there were versions of it where it was, you know, a man chop, we want a man chop. And then we kind of resisted that in time to make it more of like a subtextual thing. So it wasn't so on the nose. And in the final edit of it, it became that where it was not commenting, but just you always knew that there was this sort of hovering, lurking figure that was going to be interrupting Garfield's life in the midst of his triumph.
Wow, that actually completely blows my mind. It's so true. That's exactly how I felt without even realizing it. And that's of course the beauty of editing. But what other tricks of the trade do you try to deploy more shots that are more proximate? Are you being more wider, more observational, contextual to give us an understanding of where he is in the frame? Like, talk me through the technicalities of making sure that that's because that scene has to be so good for the audience to go along for the ride, and it really, really is.
And one aspect of it, Robert, that we didn't know for sure was how good the VFX were going to be. So
Ah,
basically, he was in this big hall, and so he was framed. He was sort of always framed with a lot of people around him, but somehow he had this foreground feeling, so that even if like Sherman was behind him or Blaine, everything else, we would cut away to those different figures, and we would always temper it by letting the other characters sort of inform us with how this is going. So like with Blaine, and with Nick Offerman and Shea Wiggum, like, oh, this is going kind of well from the
yeah,
getting aroused in the beginning. And sort of I think that we used sizes a lot to, and that part of it is traditional editing, I think, where you starting off with a big wide shot and then you kind of hone in on it, and then allowing the intercut with the axe to allow you to kind of like be medium close-ups of both of the guys and still have cutaways. And sometimes we would go back out to the convention just to sort of see like how it was all landing. Um,
yeah.
and we had sort of a pretty good deck of cards to with which to play around with, and it went through so many permutations. But again, I think it was the idea of really zoning in on being on his side and wondering what's happening with Guiteau, because he's like he's sort of getting kicked out. What's going to happen with him? And having that underlying tension that provided was an extra. It was almost like an extra bin of material inside the convention hall.
That's so cool. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've found there's a real rhythm in the premiere where Garfield's story feels really grounded and forward moving, and Guiteau's feels more chaotic and circular.
Mhm.
Was that contrast something you leaned into deliberately in the edit?
We did, because we wanted to see Garfield in that natural environment, and he's a farmer, and
Mm.
finding him there in sort of in like a more typical, usual, normal situation. Whereas Guiteau is like, you meet him, he's like, he's sort of fighting for his life right from the get-go when he's like giving his great speech. He talks a lot of truths. He talks a little bit of truth to power there in the beginning. And I'm having 3D House of Beef here. Um,
This is just part of the edit, everybody. Don't pay.
And I think that you know that was a little bit of that's a lot of it. Like you see Guiteau like crawling around the room, with his sister and everything else, and he's caught by the husband, and he's always on edge. You're never sure he's not grounded, whereas Garfield is grounded. And so I think it was conscious to be sure that we were cutting one against the other, but also, yes, editorially wise, I think there is more traditional sort of patterns in the Garfield portion rather than Guiteau.
Yeah. You've talked about your sensitivity to performance in the past, really understanding what an actor is trying to do, and sometimes maybe going back to early takes. With actors like Michael Shannon and Matthew McFadyen, what were you responding to most in shaping their performances?
I'd say to start off with Matthew because really I dug in early on to that whole speech with in front of the council. And, there were times when he was more loony. There were times when he was a little bit more crazy and much of a wink. And my goal was to make him human and to find a way to be on his side. Just like when you say, like, when an actor says, I need to be on my character's side. I'm not going to judge my character. I'm
Yeah.
just going to sort of be there for him or her. And so that was my way to like find with Matthew. And he had a lot of variation, a lot of colors. And sometimes it was sort of the earlier takes. It's like typically with, I think we've talked about this before, like typically an actor will come in and their first take they'll do what they thought they were going to do, and then they'll have an adjustment. And so the second and third takes, you get, it's like hit or miss. And then by the fifth or sixth take, the director has what she wants,
Mhm.
what she thought she wanted in terms of guiding the performance. And then as you're looking at it later, you think, you know what, really, I just need him to like listen. It doesn't have to be this big, like with Nick Offerman, when he's in the saloon. I mean, he's terrific and tremendous and full of life, but sometimes he was like way big, and I had to sort of find a way to temper him because he does become the vice president. I mean, so he is, but so you don't want a 100% drunken bully buffoon because that's in the
No.
character as it is. So you have to find that seed of, okay, is there a look, is there a moment where you see that he has that glint of humanity? And with Michael Shannon, I would say for him, interestingly, that he had, you know, I think fewer takes in general than with McFadden. If I was going to break it down in terms of how many versions of a take, because I think he comes in there and I think he's very prepared, and I think he's sort of more of an actor who has that relish rather than maybe what happens sort of you know the fluidity of like a McFadyen. I think that they're different creatures for sure. And it's been said that Shannon, everyone would think, well, Michael Shannon would be the assassin. So
Yeah.
that other thing that you had like the baggage of the two. I mean, and McFadden had just come out of Succession, so it's like these actors come with their prior roles, and you're sort of finding a way to support them and making sure that they're fresh to it and have the integrity of that new character.
Yeah, the casting is just insane, but it just works so beautifully. You can tell I really love this show. Like, I'm curious about your collaboration though with Mike Mikowski, creator writer Mike Mikowski, and director Matt Ross. This is such a tightly constructed 4 episode series. It could have been 8, could have been 12. 4 episodes in and done. How closely are you aligned on tone from the outset, and how much freedom do you have in shaping that in the edit?
I think that for me, like coming on later, I didn't really work with Matt so much.
Yeah.
So I was sort of like leaning into, I think, the writer and executive producer vision. And that was really important because you'd find out things from Mike where he wanted the humor. He wanted to make sure it was, he always thought as 4 episodes, which is kind of crazy for this sort of story. And then like the typical be 6 or 8. And then the executives who would really want pace. So I think that, whereas maybe there's more languidity in the earlier versions of it, what we ended up with was something that is really tight. I mean, when I look at it now, it just feels like it flies by. And,
Yeah.
and you get to episode four. Episode four is a little bit longer, but there's a lot of freight that it has to carry to get to the very end. And a
Yeah.
lot of things, didn't make it into the story because we felt like you needed to have, and again, I think a lot of this has to do with having a contemporary feel of just sort of, it couldn't it couldn't be a historical piece with like the long dissolves that you see where
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Because it is still a period drama after all. Although, that's That's a bit of a stretch as well, given the tonal shifts that the show does do over the four episodes. I'm curious, actually, looking back over your career, you've worked on shows that live or die on emotional and tonal precision. Where does Death by Lightning sit for you in terms of what it demanded creatively?
It was a big, big collaboration. So, I always come to these things, you know, fairly openly and, how can I contribute? And I think that because of the nature of having so many of us that were working on it, that it freed me to let's will you look at this with me, or let's split up the episode here, or let's switch it so now you have this part, or I'll do the first half, you do the second half, and then we'll switch on episode two, and you'll do the first half and I'll do the second half. So I found that it was just much more, because of the nature of it, really, really collaborative. And so it freed me to sort of understand what other people were contributing editorially. And it's not like it's competitive, but there is that sort of thing where you play off each other. You say like, "Oh, Anna did that really great thing," so I can't do exactly that, but I'm going to steal some of it. So
Yeah, yeah, that's also. In fact, I was curious about the four editors over the four episodes. What was behind that choice to have so many people in the editing bay, or maybe not at one time, but what was behind that choice?
I think it was the nature of, again, like there was when Matt had his two initial people, and then when it became more of a producer's medium, then On and I sort of took the baton. So,
Mhm.
and then ultimately we had, Bridget and Derek, who were our assistants, who we moved up to additional editors on this because I had left to do a movie at one point, and then I came back to the show, and then Anna had left, and so then I kind of ended up finishing up the show with Derek and Bridget. So there was always like a give and take, and nothing was too precious, including the material, So then, including character, I mean, there's a whole character that was basically like he's still around, but he has no lines now, and that was he had a major part, and there was a whole sort of nightmare, dreamy flashback thing that didn't make it into the cut. And part of that again was I'd say differently than other shows where I'm there from the very beginning. There's a different kind of agency that you have when you come in later because people are sort of relying on you to sort of like, okay, why don't you turn over this cut and we'll look at it and we can talk about it and you can discuss your choices, but you're coming in there more free in a way with this idea that, oh, okay, they really do want to know what I think, which I'll show them by how I'm cutting it. And that
Yeah,
I'd say a lot of that really stuck. I mean, I think it resonated with the team when there's a setting here that I'm not doing, but it's nice people can see the whole room.
it's just
Um,
giving us movement, observational movement.
it's actually, um, but just sort of having that excellent kind of back and forth,
Yeah,
and feeling like, oh, okay, yes, this idea of like cutting from one man to the other man, that stuck. And that was like, I saw that instantly that we had to do that.
yeah,
And so it's great to know like these kind of contributions then are passed on. And then, so then Anna would say, oh, like we got this one thing where I know we want to do this, but we have this one piece, which is a great transition without the guy. And then Mike was really, there was one part where he really wanted to start like with a brother and with a sister and husband, starting with them. Whereas it initially, in the way that Matt initially directed it was actually it was through Guiteau coming down the stairs and he's eavesdropping. So I was
oh
like, I
yeah,
thought and he's like hearing about like how, he should leave, you should trust him. He was with a sex colony, and that's my brother. I can't ask him to leave. And then he sort of sets him up. He says, let's have a drink to you have a new, you got a new gig, you got your loan. And then he later tells him that the best way that he can handle it is if he leaves. So initially that scene in like my world was that it was through Guiteau looking down the stairs, and so he would kind of like there were wider shots, there were shots that were through the corner more, which they're in there. But then it was really important to Mike to sort of land the husband and his point of view. So that's kind of the only time that really happens consciously that we don't do the guy to guy thing. Um,
yeah. Yeah,
Other
that's
than that, though, it
fascinating.
stayed.
It stayed. Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I started to notice it towards the end of the first episode, thinking, okay, I think I see what they're doing here. And it's really working for me. Like it really is as an audience member. Final question
Mm.
is just generally speaking, if you could pinpoint a moment from perhaps episode one that's not the convention speech, that's not necessarily the biggest sequence, but where you feel like the craft is really doing its best work, maybe invisibly, but it's just so that people can understand that the edit, you don't notice it, but you do notice it without noticing it.
I guess I'd probably say, um, and since I just already talked about the sort of flashes that we have in the very beginning when Guiteau's before the board, but after that point, where there's a real kind of decision to sort of stay with these sort of longer, push-ins, and there's different kind of size close-ups and a slow kind of softening of the board so that you kind of later understand, oh, he did convince them. And so even though mostly they were like very skeptical looking, but there's like a little bit of a softening, at times. And that there's also a point where he had to be convincing to that board and also to us as an audience. And I think that a lot of that you wouldn't really realize how much went into that, is like what lines were off camera, what lines might have changed, when it was important to go back to Guiteau to sort of clue back into his POV, really. And that somehow that is something I don't think that you necessarily realize, because there are earlier parts of that scene that are more, flashy editorial, but then it sort of sets into this kind of lulling, you know, pushing in and sort of feeling the vibe of him and getting on his side and saving that one big shot for the end, which is like, who knows, you could even be president, like withholding shots until the very end. So that's something that I think that it's a little bit more invisible, but effective, I hope.
Absolutely effective. Michael, this is one of the most sharply constructed and tonally confident series in recent memory. And I absolutely loved it. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. Good to see you.